why do we build identity systems? I would assert that the primary reason we build an identity system comes down to trust. When we create an authentication system, what we're trying to do is answer the question, can I trust that the person at the other end of this connection is who they say they are? We spend a lot of money just answering that one simple trust question. When you talk to people, what is digital identity? This is the first thing they think about, and they may never get past this, right? Just this authentication and authorization problem. Now, trust helps us believe what people say. We're constantly evaluating what people say in certain contexts and understanding whether we believe them or not based on the information that they give us. Now, trust has evolved from something that was local, the people you knew, the neighbors around you, to something that was intermediated by institutions, because as our commercial activity got larger and larger, we started dealing with a lot more strangers. And dealing with strangers was difficult because we didn't know them, we didn't have a long history. So these intermediaries allowed us to trust strangers. So things like banks, governments, educational institutions are all ways that we use intermediaries to allow us to trust strangers. Believing people online is difficult because identifiers and the things that are attached to those identifiers, attributes or claims, are frequently out of context. The way we create context is we link things together. We create lots of connections to other things, and that allows us to put things in a particular context. When we put things in context, we call that a trust framework because it's allowing us to trust the information that's inside of it. Now, identity systems are trust frameworks. When you think about identity at Amazon, for example, it's a very simple trust framework that works in a single domain, Amazon, and allows the identity system owner, Amazon in this case, to trust things about the subjects of the identity system, their customers, with some level of assurance. These kind of trust frameworks are usually centralized, and they're owned, and they're private. They're something that is built for a specific purpose by a specific company. We call them administrative identity systems because they're built to administer identity within a specific domain or a specific context. The system, the identifiers, and how they're used are all controlled by Amazon in this case, and they're all subject to Amazon's terms and conditions. They're useful for establishing trust within that specific domain, Amazon, but they're not useful outside of Amazon, or at least not generally useful. More complicated trust frameworks allow us to link various identity systems together. We typically call this federation. Probably the best known example of a trust framework, a federated trust framework, is Visa or MasterCard. I walked into a store this morning. I handed somebody whose language I don't speak a piece of plastic, and they trusted that they would get their money at the end of the day, even though I bank at a different bank in a completely different country than they use. Why did that work? Well, it worked because Visa has established a trust framework that links banks together, and then those banks have contractual contracts with their customers, me and the merchant. And so that linkage of contracts, plus all of the business processes that surround it, and the technology that underlies it, form a trust framework that allows money to flow across the world. We typically think of that trust framework, the business processes, the legal agreements, and the technology. We call that a BLT sandwich. Because it helps us remember those three things are necessary in order to create that trust framework. There are other examples besides Visa, obviously. There are a lot of federated trust frameworks. When we were on the first day, I walked into the venue down in Tallinn, and my phone was immediately connected to the Wi-Fi because of something called EduRoam. Because I work at a university, and I was at a university, and both of our universities are members of the In Common Trust framework, that my Wi-Fi just suddenly worked. I didn't have to log in and have to do anything. It was a miracle. Airbnb is another example of a trust framework. Lyft, Uber, these are all ways that we can create trust among various parties. Now, trust offline in the physical world is much more ad hoc and much more loosely coupled than the way we build trust frameworks online. If you walk into a pharmacy to fill a prescription, they might want to know whether or not you're over 18. At least that's the law in the US for certain drugs. And how do you prove that to them? Well, at least in the US, it's fairly common for you to produce your driver's license. So the pharmacy accepts your driver's license as a credential for proving that you're a certain age. Why does that work? This is clearly out of context. As Auntie mentioned, I was the CIO for the state of Utah. The driver's license division in the state of Utah does not believe that they are creating a document so that you can purchase drugs at the pharmacy. That's not why they're creating a driver's license. They're creating a driver's license to license drivers. And yet the pharmacy can use this credential to prove that you're over 18. Well, that works because of two things. One, most people trust the Driver's License Bureau to do a reasonable job of ascertaining whether or not the subject of the driver's license has a certain birth date. And they also believe the document. They believe that the document is sufficiently difficult to forge that they can trust that the document they're being presented is a real one. Now, of course, if I were transferring $1 million from one account to another, it might be worth forging a driver's license for that, and so they might want other things. So it depends on what you're trying to do, but in this context, a driver's license is perfectly legitimate for doing this. Now, the interesting thing about this is you could start a business tomorrow that needs to know that people are over 18 or that they live at a certain address, and you can immediately start taking a driver's license. You don't have to contact the Driver's License Bureau and say, hey, we want permission to do this. You don't need any kind of agreement with the Driver's License Bureau to do this. You don't need any technical integration for this to work. You just start asking people for their driver's licenses, and you can do this. Imagine being able to do that online. The way we talk about doing that online is with something called a verifiable claim. Verifiable claim is a standard, an emerging standard, it's not a standard yet, from the W3C working group on verifiable claims. Using a verifiable claim, a claim issuer, for example, my employer BYU, can provide somebody with a credential that says they work they're employed by BYU. That person can turn around and give that credential, that verifiable claim, to their bank to prove that they are employed, for example. And this doesn't require any kind of integration between the claim verifier and the claim issuer. This is a big difference from how we typically think about doing online verification today. This eliminates a lot of the slow, costly integrations that we would otherwise have to do, because there need not be any kind of commercial, contractual, or technical integration between the bank and the employer in order for this to work. And that's how verifiable claims are designed. They're designed to work in ad hoc situations, to just start using them. Now, there are four important and desirable properties that verifiable claims have. First, they're decentralized and they're contextual. There's no central authority that holds all of the claims or decides what the allowable claims are. Anyone can create any kind of claim they want about anything or anybody, and these can be held by the claim owner and conveyed to whoever needs to see them. So completely decentralized. As we mentioned, the claim verifiers do not need to contact claim issuers in order for the verification to take place. Instead, cryptography is used to allow this to happen, so that you can verify that the credential is correct without any kind of technical integration. Another important property is that verifiers make their own decisions about what kind of documents they'll take. If I'm in Starbucks and they need to know my name, I could show them my passport and they would believe that. If I'm at the border and I need to cross into another country, I can't give them my Starbucks card. They both decide what they're going to accept. You decide what you're going to accept. That's the beauty of this ad hoc, decentralized claim system. And then the fourth thing that's important is that owners decide what credentials they want to keep and what they want to carry with them. We all make decisions every day about what we want to put in our purse or our wallet and carry around with us. And that's the same thing that an identity owner can do in this world. Now, there are three things that make this work. In order to put a system together that does all of this and also respects people's privacy. The first thing is a distributed ledger. The distributed ledger in Sovereign is a public permissioned ledger. And I use both of those words because they're often not used together. By permissioned, what we mean is that there are a known set of verifiers on the ledger. By public, what we mean is that anybody can use it. This is in contrast to most other permissioned ledgers where they are private and only used by a certain set of people. The thing about the reason for using a permissioned ledger instead of a permissionless ledger comes down to cost. We want to be able to create decentralized identifiers that are pairwise and pseudonymous. What that means is that every person is going to create hundreds or maybe even thousands of identifiers, because you have a different identifier for every relationship. This prevents correlation between third parties, which is a key aspect of privacy on Sovereign. Excuse me. And in order to make that functional, you have to reduce the cost of identifiers substantially. In order to reduce the cost of identifiers, you need a permissioned ledger. So that's why a public permissioned ledger. Drummond Reed spoke yesterday about decentralized identifiers. He's going to speak again today about some of the use cases around decentralized identifiers, so I won't belabor this point. But decentralized identifiers are a key part of this. Because if I give you a decentralized identifier, you have to be able to resolve it to know things about me. Now, what do you need to know? No private information, but you need to know my public key, and you need to know which service endpoints you can use to contact me. So a verifiable claim is going to reference at least a couple of DIDs, decentralized identifiers. It's going to reference the decentralized identifier of the subject, and it's going to have the decentralized identifier of the issuer. That's so that the verifier can say, oh, I can verify that this is about this subject, and I can verify that this was issued by a particular party. Third part is this idea of verifiable claims that we've been talking about. But I want to introduce one added concept, and that is the concept of zero-knowledge proofs and minimal disclosure. Because we don't necessarily want to take a verifiable claim from my employer that includes all kinds of data about me and my employment and just hand it off to the bank to prove that I'm employed. The only thing the bank needs to know is that I'm employed. And so that's the only thing I'm going to give them, and the way I achieve that is with something called a zero-knowledge proof. Let's talk about this term self-sovereign. Sovereign, the word sovereign makes some people nervous. It makes some countries nervous when they think about their citizens being sovereign. What does that mean? In 1648, a bunch of principalities got together and signed the Treaties of Westphalia that ended 30 years of religious warfare. This was the beginning of our modern notion of states that have borders. And it's borders that sovereignty is important for. Sovereignty defines the border within which something or somebody has control and the area outside of which they don't. Now, in the case of a state, it defines the area within which the state has a monopoly on violence and outside of which they don't. So outside of their borders, they have to treat with other nations as equals. Inside their borders, they have complete control over what happens. Same thing's true when we talk about self-sovereign identity. It defines very clearly the border within which the individual has complete control and outside of which the individual has to relate to others as peers. That's what we mean when we say self-sovereign identity. It doesn't mean you get control over everything, because the only way you can do that is if you live alone on an island. You have to have relationships with other people, and if they're self-sovereign, that means you have to treat them as peers. So another vital feature of a self-sovereign, decentralized identity system, especially one that uses a public ledger, has to be privacy. Privacy by design is baked deep into the system, and it's represented by three fundamental properties, or three fundamental features of the architecture. First, as I mentioned, identifiers on sovereign are pairwise pseudonymous by default. That means that every relationship you have is going to have a separate identifier. There's no notion of a universal identifier inside the system. Every relationship has a separate identifier. This prevents correlation and allows every relationship to be individualized, to essentially have its own public-private key pair that can be used for secure messaging, for example, between those two entities. Second, personal data is never written to the ledger. This is an important concept because you'll see a lot of systems that are writing personal data onto the ledger, and even in encrypted form, we don't believe that that's safe. So personal data is always kept in separate repositories that we call agents. The only thing the ledger is used for, well, not the only thing, the primary thing the ledger is used for is linking an identifier to a public key and a service endpoint so that you can go find the information that you need if you have permission. And the third thing is this concept of zero-knowledge proofs for minimal disclosure. These three things together create a system that we believe has privacy by design and is secure. Now, what we've been describing is a sort of universal trust framework. Rather than a trust framework designed for credit card payments, or a trust framework designed for linking people who want to rent their house to people who want to rent the house, like Airbnb, or people who need rides with people who have cars, like Uber or BlaBlaCar. These are all specific trust frameworks that were built for a specific purpose. Think about what had to happen. If you wanted to start a ride-sharing company today, you've got to build the entire trust framework. How do you identify drivers? How do you identify riders? How do you link them all together? Sovereign allows you to have a lot of that work already done because it creates this system where everybody understands how to read identifiers, everybody understands how to issue and verify claims. Now that work is all done. In 1986, I started using the internet. It was a marvelous revelation, right? That this thing existed. And nobody around me could even understand what this meant, right? That I could send messages to other people in other countries, and how does this work? And there were all kinds of other systems like CompuServe and AOL and those kinds of things that allowed some of that to happen inside their walled gardens. The internet presented us with a universal system of communication, and it changed the world because it did that. Today we're in a similar situation. We have all of these private walled gardens of trust. It's hard for us to imagine what it would mean to have a universal trust framework that everybody could use, but that is what we're talking about. And I think it has similar potential to transform how we do business and how we interact with each other. Now, we can't get away without mentioning GDPR. There are built-in ways of doing consent receipts, both recording that consent was given and recording what consent was received. Doesn't mean you don't have to do other work on top of that to actually make that work within your system, but all of the consent is automatically recorded inside of this. So let me talk for just a second about some of the use cases. Obviously, logging in, but that's kind of table stakes, right? That's what we would expect out of any kind of system. Healthcare, Dr. Manny Najit has been here at the conference. I think he's gone today, but he is exploring how this system can be used to provide credentials inside the national healthcare system in Britain for doctors and nurses and other healthcare professionals. Education, as Antti mentioned, I'm at Brigham Young University. We're looking at how we can use this system for not just the end credential that the university produces, but actually issue verifiable claims about every kind of learning activity. Completed a class, completed a text, read certain chapters, all of this could be verifiable claims that then could be used by other systems. Refugees and other disadvantaged populations. We have a partner, iRespond, who is using this system in a pilot to help refugees in both Africa and Asia. And finally, banking. USAA, CU Ledger, lots of credit unions are in pilots to use this for both their call centers and for KYC. So what's the status of the network today? Their provisional network is live. There are about a dozen stewards around the world who are actually achieving consensus on the network. It's provisional because we're limiting access and use right now in order to make sure everything works, but it is the live network. It's the ledger that will be for all time. And we're anticipating that it will be generally available sometime later this year, so anybody can use it. So, I think, as I mentioned, that there is a seismic shift happening around how we use trust in the world because of our ability now to be able to have ad hoc credentials that we can carry around and use online just the way we do offline. And I think it's going to help not just businesses be more profitable, but people be more private and secure. And those things can happen at the same time. So.
Wonderful, thank you. I did give you a few minutes of extra time because I think I saw that you're kind of finishing up, and but we'll keep it with one question. If you notice that there's a lot of questions coming in, and there's also questions being answered in the chat, so please check there first. What I would like to ask you is a simple question. What can these people do right now regarding sovereign, and what do you recommend them doing?
So there's a couple of ways to get involved. The easiest thing to do is to just go to sovereign.org and sign up for the Slack, sign up for the forum, and start participating in discussions. There are working groups that you can join if you're interested in helping. If you are an organization that would like to run a node on the network, we're actively recruiting and putting stewards online to run validation nodes. And there's a sandbox that you can get code for and start working on projects, start running things. It's a good time to get started and get exploring what's going on here.
Okay, thank you very much, Phil. And let's move on next to Ageni Rusu.